I've worked in remote areas before, but nothing prepared me for what awaited in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. This wasn't just another off-the-grid gig. There was something wrong here. I could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, the moment I set foot near the lodge I was supposed to look after. The instructions I received were odd, to say the least. A plain white envelope left at a post office containing a brief job description, a map, and a list of rules. No formal interview, no typical hiring process. But the money promised was enough to get me through winter, so I didn't question it. As I drove deeper into the mountains, my cell signal cut out, and the sense of isolation grew. The trees were so dense that daylight barely filtered through, casting the landscape in perpetual twilight. I reached the cabin just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The building was ancient, made of dark timber that seemed to absorb light. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but I knew from the detailed notes that people had stayed here recently. I didn't expect a typical job, but the list of rules sent a shiver down my spine. These weren't ordinary instructions. The paper had a sense of urgency, almost like a warning, a plea to follow the guidelines strictly. Here's how they went. Lock all doors before sunset, no exceptions. If you forget, do not attempt to lock them after the sun has gone down. It's safer to leave them open. Avoid looking out the windows after midnight. You may hear noises, whispers, or tapping. Ignore them. Do not respond. Do not leave the property between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. This is not a safe time to be outdoors. Stay inside, regardless of what you hear. If you find items moved or misplaced during the night, don't put them back. Leave them exactly where they are. The rest of the rules detailed mundane tasks like keeping the generator fueled and maintaining the fireplace, but those first 4 they had my full attention. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was part of some elaborate tradition or a local scare tactic, but the uneasy feeling never left me. First night, unsettling encounters. That night, I tried to follow the rules as best I could. Locked the doors before sunset. Check, ignored the windows after midnight, not a problem. But I soon realized that this lodge wasn't just old, it was alive. Around 2:30 a.m., the noises began soft at first, like a breeze through the trees, but it quickly escalated into something more sinister. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, circled the cabin. I froze, gripping the edge of the chair, straining to hear. Who could be out there this deep in the wilderness? The footsteps stopped, replaced by soft tapping on the windows. I clenched my jaw, repeating the second rule in my mind. Do not look out the windows after midnight. The tapping continued, growing louder. Tap, 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 rhythmic, almost beckoning. It was like someone or something was testing my patience, trying to lure me closer. I fought the urge to look. Every part of my body screamed to just take a peek, but something deep inside warned me that breaking the rule would lead to something far worse than curiosity could satisfy. I forced myself to remain seated, eyes shut, heart pounding. The disturbing discovery. By morning, the silence outside was deafening. I hadn't slept a wink, and my nerves were shot. But as I went about my daily chores, I noticed something off. An old lantern I kept on the mantel had been moved to the front door. I hadn't touched it. Following the rules, I left it there and continued about my day, though the dread lingered. The second night was even worse. At precisely 3 a.m., the noises returned this time, louder and more frantic. The footsteps circled the lodge again, faster and with more urgency. I heard what sounded like low whispers, unintelligible, as if carried by the wind. The tapping began again, this time accompanied by scratching. Claws, nails, I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. Suddenly, there was a loud thud at the back door. My heart raced, and I froze, recalling the third rule. Do not leave the property between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. Whatever was out there, it wanted in. The scratching grew more insistent, the whispers turning into a distorted chorus of voices. I covered my ears, desperate for the hour to pass. The final revelation. On the third night, the lodge seemed colder, darker, more hostile. I locked the doors before sunset as usual, but the atmosphere felt different. It was as though the lodge itself was watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I tried to stay calm, focusing on the mundane tasks, but when midnight came, the dread returned tenfold. Around 1 a.m., the tapping began again. This time, it wasn't coming from the windows, it was inside the cabin. A soft, deliberate tapping on the floorboards, moving closer to where I sat. I clutched the lantern, my only source of light, and stood up, my body tense. Then I saw it, a shadow of figure lurking in the corner of the room. It wasn't fully formed, just a dark mass that seemed to suck the light out of the space around it. My heart pounded in my chest as it moved toward me, slowly, deliberately. The figure stopped a few feet away, and for the first time, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I gasped, paralyzed by fear, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. I ran out of that lodge at dawn, leaving behind everything but my car keys. I drove until I reached the nearest town, never looking back. I never returned for my things, never asked about the job, and I certainly never spoke about what happened there until now. The rules, they weren't just bizarre traditions. They were survival guidelines. Something ancient, something evil, roamed those mountains, and the lodge was a prison designed to keep it at bay. I can only hope the next caretaker is smart enough to follow the rules, because breaking them doesn't just lead to danger. It opens the door to something far worse than death. For weeks after I left the lodge, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of dread. It felt like the shadow of that place had followed me. Every time the sun went down, I found myself watching the windows, expecting to hear that same persistent tapping. Sometimes, I thought I saw movement in the corners of my apartment just out of sight. The rational part of my brain told me it was all in my head, the aftermath of a stressful experience. But there were moments, late at night, when my logic couldn't. I reached out to the company that hired me, desperate for answers, but I got no response. Every email bounced back, and the phone number listed on the letter was no longer in service. It was as if the people who hired me had vanished into thin air. A part of me wondered if they ever really existed. One night, while I was in bed, half asleep, I heard a familiar sound. Tap, 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 the same rhythmic knocking that haunted me in the lodge. My heart leaped into my throat, and I sat up straight, my breath frozen in my chest. It was coming from the window. The same instinct I'd felt back in the mountains washed over me. Don't look. But this was my home. I wasn't in that cursed lodge anymore. I had to know what was out there. Slowly, I crept toward the window, feeling my pulse thundering in my ears. The tapping grew louder, almost impatient. Tap, tap, tap. With trembling hands, I pulled back the curtain. Nothing, no one was there. But just as I exhaled in relief, a faint whisper floated through the night air. The words were impossible to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the same haunting voice I'd heard during those long, terrifying nights in the lodge. Something had followed me. Determined to understand what I'd been through, I started researching the history of the Appalachian Lodge. I dug through old town records, library archives, and local legends, but the deeper I looked, the more questions I had. The place didn't officially exist. There were no records of a lodge built in that specific area of the mountains, and no mention of a caretaker position like the one I had. It was as if the place was a well-kept secret, something hidden from public knowledge. But then, buried deep in a dusty old book about Appalachian folklore, I found a clue. The book mentioned a place called the Whispering Lodge, a cursed cabin hidden in the remote parts of the Appalachian wilderness. According to the legend, the lodge had been a meeting place for a secret society in the 1800s, a group obsessed with the occult. They conducted dark rituals, calling upon ancient spirits from the forest, spirits that were never meant to be summoned. One ritual went horribly wrong, binding one of the spirits to the lodge itself. The members of the society vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of their existence and a warning. Anyone who dared to stay in the lodge would be subjected to the spirit's will. It couldn't harm you outright, but it could manipulate reality, driving its victims to madness or worse. The legend described a set of rules, similar to the ones I had followed, as the only way to keep the spirit at bay. But the most disturbing part was this: if you broke any of the rules, the spirit would follow you, no matter where you went. It wasn't confined to the lodge, it was bound to the person. I knew what I had to do. If the spirit had followed me, then the only way to stop it was to return to the lodge and confront whatever was haunting me. I packed up my car and made the long, grueling drive back into the Appalachian mountains. Every mile closer felt like a weight on my chest, a growing sense of doom. The lodge looked exactly the same as I'd left it. Dark, cold, and unwelcoming. But this time, it felt different. There was a certain heaviness in the air, like the place was waiting for me. As soon as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, sending a chill down my spine. I knew the spirit was there. It was watching me. The atmosphere inside the lodge was oppressive, the silence louder than any sound. I stood in the middle of the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to calm the rising panic. What did it want from me? What had I done to deserve this? Suddenly, the lantern, the same one that had mysteriously moved before, flickered to life on the mantelpiece, casting a dim, eerie glow. And then I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing at the far end of the room. It was the same shape, the same darkness I had glimpsed before. It hadn't just followed me, it had been waiting for my return. For a long moment, I just stared at it, paralyzed by fear. The shadow didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul. Slowly, I stepped toward it, my body trembling uncontrollably. I didn't know what I was going to do. Part of me wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The spirit had already attached itself to me. There was no escape. As I approached, the air around me grew colder, and the whispers began again, soft and insistent. This time, they weren't unintelligible. They were speaking to me, calling my name in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices at once. "You broke the rules, I didn't." I whispered back, barely able to form the words. The shadow shifted, growing larger, more menacing. The lantern flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the darkness pressing down on my chest. I was suffocating under the weight of it. "You broke the rules," the voices repeated, louder this time, more accusing. And then, in a moment of terrifying clarity, I realized what they meant. It wasn't just the rules of the lodge I had broken, it was the unspoken rule of confronting the spirit itself. By returning to the lodge, I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Suddenly, the shadow lunged toward me. I fell backward, crashing into the old wooden floor. The air around me swirled with darkness, the whispers now a deafening roar. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought it was all over. But then, everything went still. I opened my eyes, finding myself back in the chair in the corner of the lodge, the room dimly lit by the lantern. I blinked in confusion. Had I imagined it all? No, this wasn't right. I looked around, heart racing. The lodge felt the same, but something was off. The weight of the shadow was gone, but the sense of dread lingered. That's when I saw it. A new set of rules had been laid out on the table, written in the same ominous handwriting as before. But these rules weren't for the lodge, they were for me. I could barely bring myself to read them, but the first line made my blood run cold. "Welcome back, Caretaker. You are bound to this place now." And that's when I understood the true horror of it all. There was no escaping the lodge, no breaking free from the spirit. The rules weren't just guidelines, they were a sentence, a life sentence. I am the caretaker now, forever trapped in the cycle of the Whispering Lodge. And no matter where you go, if you hear tapping at your window late at night, don't look. Don't listen, because once you break the rules, there's no turning back. Days turned into weeks, and the lodge became my prison. Time had no meaning there. I stopped counting the sunsets or the number of times I tried to sleep through the cold, unnerving nights. The whispering never ceased, always at the edge of my hearing, reminding me that I was no longer free. I was bound to this place, just as the old caretakers must have been before me. But there was no escape, not for them, and not for me. I continued to follow the new set of rules meticulously. Each day felt like a desperate attempt to cling to sanity. I left the lantern burning all night, as instructed. I greeted the empty space in the mirror every morning, even though I could feel the shadow lurking just behind me. But the rules weren't just about survival anymore, they had become part of me, integrated into my very existence. Every now and then, I'd hear something that sounded like footsteps outside the lodge, but I knew better than to investigate. The forest around me had grown thick and impenetrable, as if the very land had conspired to keep me here. Even if I wanted to leave, there was no path, no way out. I was trapped. I spent hours combing through the lodge for any clue that might help me understand how this curse worked. But there were no journals from past caretakers, no evidence that anyone else had ever lived there. It was as if the lodge itself erased the memory of those who came before, leaving nothing behind but the whispers of the cursed. One night, just as I was losing hope, I heard something different. It wasn't the usual tapping or distant footsteps. This was the sound of tires crunching gravel, of a car pulling up outside. My heart pounded as I rushed to the window, peeking out cautiously. There was a car, parked at the edge of the clearing, headlights off. Someone was getting out, a visitor. I hadn't seen another human being in what felt like a lifetime. I knew what the rules said, never invite anyone inside the lodge, but this time, I couldn't help myself. The thought of seeing someone else, of talking to someone from the outside world, was overwhelming. I rushed to the door, flinging it open just as the visitor reached the porch. A man stood there, dressed in a long coat, looking as disoriented as I had when I first arrived at this cursed place. "Are you the caretaker?" he asked, his voice tired but polite. I swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, but you shouldn't be here. This place, it's dangerous." The man gave me a strange look, as if he didn't quite understand. "I got a letter," he said, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper from his coat. "I was offered a job here, something about caretaking." My blood ran cold. A new caretaker? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The cycle was starting over. The lodge wasn't done, it was bringing in fresh victims, just like it had done with me. "You need to leave," I said urgently, stepping forward. "Right now, before it's too late." But the man didn't move. He looked past me, his eyes drawn to the lodge, as if something inside was calling to him. "I think I'm supposed to be here," he murmured, taking a step toward the door. I knew what would happen next. If he stepped inside, he would be trapped just like I was. The lodge would consume him, and there would be no escape. But maybe, just maybe, this was my way out. If someone else took over the caretaker position, would the curse release me? The temptation to let him in was strong. For a brief moment, I considered it. I could walk away, leave this nightmare behind. But then I saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear I had felt when I first arrived. I couldn't do it. I couldn't doom him to the same fate. "No," I said, stepping in front of him. "You're not going inside, not tonight." The man looked at me, confused. "What do you mean?" "I've come all this way. I don't care. Turn around. Get back in your car and drive. Do not come back." I could see the conflict in his eyes, but something in my voice must have convinced him. With a reluctant nod, he turned back toward his car. I watched him leave, the headlights disappearing into the trees. I was alone again. But for the first time since arriving at the lodge, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had broken the cycle, at least for now. That night, as I sat by the fire, I felt the presence of the shadow again. It was stronger this time, more insistent. The lodge was angry. I had interfered with its plans, broken the unspoken rule by turning away the new caretaker. The whispers were louder than ever, filling the room with their accusations. "You broke the rules, you broke the rules." But this time, I didn't care. I had defied the lodge, and in doing so, I had reclaimed a small piece of myself. The whispers continued, swirling around me like a storm, but I remained calm, staring into the flames. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The air in the lodge shifted, the oppressive weight lifting. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe. I looked around, half expecting the shadow to appear, but the room was empty. The spirit was gone. Had I done it? Had I truly broken the curse? I stood up, cautiously stepping toward the door. The rules were gone from the table, vanished without a trace. The lodge felt different, no longer malevolent, no longer watching me. I reached for the door, my heart racing as I opened it and stepped outside. The forest was still, bathed in the soft light of the moon. The path leading away from the lodge was clear. I walked to my car, half expecting something to stop me, but nothing did. The night was silent, peaceful. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. As I drove away from the lodge, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. In the rearview mirror, I saw the lodge standing there, dark and empty. It didn't look threatening anymore, just a forgotten place in the middle of nowhere. But I knew the truth. I knew what lived inside. I didn't look back again. It's been months since I left the lodge, and I've never gone back. I don't know if the curse is truly broken, or if the lodge is simply waiting for its next victim. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, faint, distant, but there. They follow me, just on the edge of hearing, as if reminding me that I will never truly be free. And I know one thing for sure. Somewhere, deep in the Appalachian mountains, the Whispering Lodge still stands, waiting.